Well, good morning, everyone. Welcome back to Morning Musings. My name is Don K. Preston. I am the president of Preterist Research Institute of Ardmore, Oklahoma, and we are continuing our examination, our response and refutation of Brock Hollett's book entitled Debunking Preterism. And this is video number 12. We're taking a look today at Mr. Hollett's discussion of the Abomination of Desolation. In Matthew chapter 24, verse 15, Jesus said, "When you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet, let him who reads understand, then let those who are in Judea flee." And he urged them, pray that your flight is not in winter, pray that you're not with child, etc., etc. And so Jesus' warning about the abomination of desolation was very graphic. And the abomination of desolation would lead directly to, it would cause the Great Tribulation. Now, Mr. Hollett goes into, he really struggles to try to explain away any first century application. But folks, here's the undeniable reality. There is no question whatsoever that the subject of the abomination of desolation is not the easiest biblical subject in all of the world. But here are a couple of undeniable realities. As Brent Petrie points out in his book, Jesus and the Great Tribulation and the end of bondage. Look that up. Anyway, Brent Petrie makes some really cogent and important points. He says that the term abomination of desolation must be viewed, and by the way, many other scholars have noted this, all right? I'm not saying this on any kind of authority of my own. It is literally the abomination that brings or that causes desolation. So, abomination, and by the way, that word, as used in the Old Testament, is the word that is used of sin. So we could put it sort of kind of like this. The sin that brings the desolation. Now here's something that is absolutely critical. Mr. Hollett believes that the abomination of desolation is some kind of a pagan image that the man of sin sets up sometime in the future after the rapture. He covenants with Israel, they rebuild the temple, and then after 3.5 years he breaks that covenant and he sets up his image. So here we have a pagan, Gentile, setting up an image in the temple. That, to Mr. Hollett, is the abomination. Well, there's something horribly, tragically wrong with that. The abomination, historically, would have been a sin committed by Israel. And here's the critical point of this. The only way that Yahweh ever allowed any pagans to come into Jerusalem and to desecrate the city, to destroy the city, to desolate and desecrate the temple was if Israel had sinned. In other words, the pagan invasion was not the abomination that caused desolation, it was the desolation itself. This is an important distinction. So, does Mr. Hollett believe that at some future point of time, Israel commits such a heinous sin that it brings about the destruction of that yet future temple? No, he believes that it's the man of sin that commits that sin. That completely reverses the biblical testimony of things. Furthermore, once again, Mr. Hollett is guilty of creating a yet future third temple. Now look, he admits the disciples could have had no understanding of such a thing. He admits it's not in the text of Matthew chapter 24. they would have automatically assumed that Jesus was talking about the temple that was standing there, the signs of the destruction of that. I mean, after all, the disciples asked when Jesus said, "Do you not see all of these things?" He didn't say, when some future generation sees what I'm talking about. He said to living, breathing human beings, when you see these things, know that her desolation is nigh. Folks, it is only by distorting the language that Mr. Hollett is able to give any semblance of credence to his views. And let's not forget that Jesus said, "You will see these things," to his living, breathing disciples. And then he said, "Verily I say unto you, this generation," once again, not some far off generation, but this generation shall by no means pass until all of these things are fulfilled. And there's something else here. Notice that Jesus said, "Do you not see all of these things? The time is coming in which not one stone shall be left standing on top of another." It is important to realize that in Jeremiah chapter 4, Jeremiah chapter 5, Jeremiah chapter 7, even Jeremiah kind of 12 sort of kind of hints at it. But in Jeremiah 4 and 5 specifically, in predicting the fall of Jerusalem in 586 BC, the Lord said specifically, or Jeremiah said through the word of the Lord, that he was not going to make a full end of Israel, and the people. No full end. However, after that destruction of 586 BC, in Daniel chapter 9, 26 and 27, what do we find? We find the tremendous prophecy of the 70 weeks. And the Lord predicted what? The full end. The full end would come with an overwhelming flood of destruction. Now, Brock Hollett has to completely and totally ignore the AD 70 destruction of Jerusalem, which was a complete, utter, total destruction of the temple and the city, and say, well, okay, yeah, Jerusalem was destroyed in AD 70, but the real end, the real full end, that's the third temple. Oh, and then Jesus rebuilds a fourth temple. That is pure theological conjecture and contrived theology. There is no justification for it. The people of the prince that will come will destroy the city and the sanctuary, and the end thereof, the full end thereof, shall be with an overwhelming flood. Now here's what's interesting on that. In Nehemiah chapter 9, looking back on the destruction of Jerusalem in 586 BC, Nehemiah said, "Our fathers sinned against you. They transgressed the law, and you destroyed them, but you did not make a full end of them. However, should we sin again, as we have done, you will make a full end of us." Do you catch the power of that? Here is Nehemiah chapter 9, saying, when the Lord destroyed Jerusalem in 586 BC, he did not make a full end of the people, the city, and the temple. But now Nehemiah says, that's Ezra chapter 9. Here is Ezra saying, Lord, we sinned against you. You brought judgment against us, but it was not the full end. But we know and acknowledge that if we do this again, if we sin against you so grievously, so heinously, you will make a full end of us. And I want to share something with you. In Matthew chapter 12, 43 to 45, Jesus told a parable. And he told a parable of a man who had an evil spirit. And that evil spirit was cast out. And that spirit went wandering around until finally it returned to the original man. And finding that place empty, finding that man not having replaced that evil spirit with good, with holiness, with righteousness, that evil spirit went and found 7 other spirits more wicked than himself, and he came back and inhabited that man, and the latter end was worse than the beginning, worse than ever, and Jesus said, so shall it be with this generation. Jesus was calling his generation the worst generation ever. And what did Ezra say? Ezra said, Lord, if we sin against you again, as we have done, you will make a full end of us. And so here's Jesus saying his generation was the worst. His generation would fill up the measure of their sin. They would be the recipients, the brunt of the overwhelming flood of destruction. There is no prediction of a return from the full end. There was from the partial end. The Lord said He'd bring them back, said He would restore them, said He would glorify them. But in the destruction of AD 70, the Lord made a full end. Now what that demands is that the abomination of desolation, which would lead to destruction, in other words, the sin of Israel, that would lead to her destruction and her full end, had to have occurred in the first century. And you know what? In next week's examination of the abomination of desolation and the great tribulation, I'll prove that to you beyond any shadow of a doubt. Well, thanks so much for joining me for this morning's morning musings. I appreciate you being with us so very, very much. You have a fantastic weekend. We'll see you on Monday.